Right. Wonderful. That's why we're here. For you, I find it slightly alarming to see how young you all are. You're all younger than my youngest child. But I'm your moderator for the day. My name is Quentin Peel. I'm a journalist. I apologize for that. An observer of humanity, and delighted to be back here again at our kids at the Democracy Study Center here in Kiev. Barbara, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for everything you've done. Wolfgang's already paid tribute to that. I didn't expect it to be quite so warm. So it's actually very nice to be here on a wonderful sunny day. We're going to have 4 conversations today, and it's my job to just help conduct those conversations and engage everybody in the room to take part. But we have a wonderful bunch of speakers who've come. And what we're going to do is start with, if you like, a big conversation about populism and the future of democracy. A challenge, I think, right around the world. And we'll have a debate on that. Then we'll look at how we turn politics into practice. Let's look at our cities. Wolfgang already mentioned 2 things. One, about the idea of decentralizing democracy, that actually democracy from the bottom up is healthy democracy. That's what we're all trying to revive and stimulate and create. But also that our cities are the sources of revolutions, of new thinking, of dynamism and drama. So we're going to look at the whole area of how you bring life to the cities through urban planning. The third conversation we're going to have is about culture and migration and integrating people into their history with art and culture and the idea of heritage. And finally, we're going to look at the economy, jobs, how we get growth without ruining our environment. And behind all of these things is a theme that I think we'll look at again tomorrow, the theme of how do we cope with corruption, which is undermining our sense of democracy. Now, our very first speaker, our keynote speaker, before we have the panel here today, is a very close and dear friend of mine, Edward Luce, who's come all the way from Washington, because he wrote a book 2 years ago called The Retreat of Western Liberalism. Now, Edward and I were both journalists at the Financial Times, but Edward has had a much more exotic career than ever I did. He's been in the Philippines, he's been in India, he was in London, and now he's in Washington, where he's observed at very close hand the entire Trump phenomenon. I'm sitting in London observing the Brexit phenomenon. You are sitting here in Ukraine observing the Zelensky phenomenon, and there are those in Russia looking at Putin, and in the whole of Europe looking at the rise of populism. So I'm going to ask Ed to kick us off with a keynote that won't be long, but we'll look at the challenge to Western liberalism, the challenge to democracy as we've known it. Is this actually a mortal threat, or is it a sign that the whole democratic debate is opening up to new ideas, new challenges, and new life? Ed, will you come up and give us our first speech? Do you want to?
Thank you, Quentin. Quentin was the man who gave me my first job at the Financial Times, and he paid me less than somebody who gets hired to wash dishes. So I'm still a great friend. I'm still very fond of Quentin, but I haven't forgotten.
We all have to start somewhere.
It's a particular delight to be here as a guest of Barbara, and to be looking at that wall at the other end of this room, drawings clearly by children, beautiful pictures, something I'm not used to when I give a speech. You don't see that at the back of the room, and it's a testament to the extraordinary things you're doing here. We're going to talk about democracy and populism, but there's something that John F. Kennedy said, that the democratic society is built on numberless small acts of kindness. And I think you're a personification of that spirit, that democracy is not about big statesmen, male statesmen. Ultimately, it's about how citizens behave, what civic society is. And Barbara is a walking personification of that. So it's an enormous pleasure to be here as your guest. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes about why there is a crisis of democracy, why there is a populist crisis going on in Western democracies. And it feels a little bit incongruous speaking to you here in Kiev, a city I've never visited, shortly after you've conducted this extraordinary democratic presidential election where a guy from nowhere with no previous political experience is elected president, and you have a peaceful transfer of power, which is a moment of pride, I think, for Ukraine as an emerging democracy. So my apologies, I'm going to be talking about problems with democracy in the West for a little while, and then we'll get to debate, and then we'll get to debating some of the larger topics, including Ukraine. So Quentin mentioned Brexit in my country, Britain leaving the European Union. And he also mentioned that I've been observing Donald Trump, and writing about Trump, and I've been in America for a while, so I've watched his rise. And these twin events in 2016, Brexit, and then the election of Trump, are seen as the beginning of the Western populist crisis. There was a very funny, I'll say this slowly because it might get lost in translation, but there was a very funny headline by a comedic sketch writer in the New Yorker magazine on the night that Brexit happened. He wrote, British lose long-cherished right to look down on Americans as more stupid than they are. And I thought that summarized perfectly what happened. Then a few months later, America elected Trump and leveled that playing field again. But we're wrong to think the populist crisis began in 2016. It began many, many years before that. 2016 was the twin volcanic explosions. And let me just sort of give you two examples of the depth of this crisis and how long it had been brewing. In America, you have as a creed, since its beginning, equality of opportunity. The idea that if you work hard and you show entrepreneurial ingenuity, you can get ahead. You can move up. You can be born in rags and move up to riches. That's not been true in America for quite a long time now. If you're born into the bottom fifth of American society, something like 98% chance that your children will remain in the bottom fifth. This is a very un-American, it's a very, very un-American thing, that the mobility of income, that the ladder of opportunity has been taken away, and it's been perceived by people to have been taken away. So a lot of the anger in America is about the idea that it's no longer a land of opportunity for most people. And I think that's really, really important. There is a phrase, no bourgeoisie, no democracy. If you don't have a middle, if you don't have a strong middle, you don't have in the economy, then you don't have a strong middle ground in politics. And that's what's been happening. The middle has been collapsing in America. Let me give you a brief anecdote of how I view democracy. In 1989, before most of you were born, I was a student studying at Oxford in England, and we heard that the Berlin Wall was collapsing. This was November 1989. And so a bunch of us got on a train went to Dover, took a ferry across the English Channel to Zeebrugge, and then we rented a car and we drove very, very fast up the German Autobahn, which you're allowed to do, no speed limits in Germany, and got to Berlin, and we joined in. People had pickaxes. They were basically chipping down that wall. We got quite drunk, and we drove home with a hangover and bits of wall in the back of the car. I lost my bit, but anyway, I was there. I have pictures. And we had this feeling that was put into words by the famous American scholar Francis Fukuyama, that we were witnessing the end of history. Now, by the end of history, Fukuyama meant the end of any ideological question about what the best kind of society is. So fascism had been defeated in the mid-20th century. Now, in 1989, the other twin totalitarian ideology, communism, was collapsing peacefully, with the exception of Romania, almost without a shot being fired. And we believed this. We believed that there was no longer a dispute about what the best system was: liberal democracy, free market liberal democracy. And the 1990s, that showed, to, roughly speaking, to be true. By the end of the 1990s, there were twice as many democracies in the world as there were at the beginning of the 1990s. But since the early 2000s, really in the last 15 years, the number of democracies has shrunk. There are now 20 fewer significant democracies today than there were in 2006. Countries like Turkey can no longer be defined as a democracy. Venezuela obviously cannot be defined as one. Thailand has had a military coup. Even Russia. Russia was, during the 90s, an imperfect oligarchic democracy, but it was on that Fukuyama escalator. It was going up. We had this idea that everybody is on an escalator. So even Russia, has ceased to be a democracy. But most importantly, some of those countries that in 1989 were peacefully becoming democracies, rejecting communism, like Hungary and like Poland, are today very questionable. Are they democracies? Are they illiberal democracies? Can you remain permanently an illiberal democracy, or are you in transition, essentially, to soft autocracy, or what in Putin's Russia we call electoral autocracy, Potemkin democracy? There are many phrases, but you understand the meaning. So Fukuyama himself, the same man who proclaimed the end of history, now talks about a democratic recession around the world. And the question is why? And so I won't go on too long, because this is a very complex subject and we're going to be talking about it. But let me just give you two reasons. The first is a collapse of trust in our institutions. Democracy is about institutions. Liberal democracy is about having the rule of law, independent civic society, freedom of the media, and so forth. It's not just about voting every 3 or 4 years. It is about how society runs itself. And there has been a collapse across the board of trust in our institutions. This collapse has been particularly strong in the United States and Britain. And I think, for reasons I mentioned earlier, the middle in Britain and the United States has collapsed more completely and shrunk more extensively than in most other liberal democracies, Germany, for example. So when you lose trust, you lose faith. When you lose faith, you turn to, in religious world, you turn to either agnosticism. You don't really care, you don't really have any beliefs, which I think we see in democracy: declining participation, declining membership, declining activism, declining civic life. What one American scholar calls bowling alone, where you go bowling alone. Or you turn to atheism. And atheism is a much more angry, militant opposition to religious belief, which in democratic terms is populism. Populism is anti-system politics. It is, I think, the most strong manifestation of this collapse of trust. And the second thing that has been going wrong in, oh, don't worry, I can hear. The second thing that has been going wrong is the decline of meritocracy. I think it's off. It's the decline of meritocracy, which as I say, has happened most completely in Britain and the United States. There are democracies in Europe that are doing fine. One example is Ireland. My wife is from Ireland. Ireland has had very, very little populism. It's clearly been progressing. They've been having referendums on things like abortion and gay marriage. They are a bright light in a rather dim room of continuing progress. I think it's no accident that Ireland has seen rising incomes across the board. It has got an expanding, growing middle class to the extent that all these Irish people working around the world, the Irish diaspora, a lot of them have been going back to Ireland since the recovery from the 2008 crisis. As I mentioned, Germany, I think, is also suffering from populism. It's extremely worrying to see the AfD, breach the 10% barrier. But it's nothing like the level of populism you're seeing in Britain, the United States, Italy, and possibly France. Nothing like. And I think part of the reason for that is that Germany still invests a lot in middle-class skills, and people in middle-class jobs get paid reasonably well. People in Germany are less likely than Americans to say that their children will be worse off than they are. In Britain and America, a majority say they're going to be worse off. So those are really the two reasons, the sort of collapse of trust in institutions and the decline of belief in meritocracy. Let me end on a slightly more positive note, though. This book I wrote, as Quentin mentioned, The Retreat of Western Liberalism, my publisher wanted to call it the collapse of Western liberalism, because they believed that it would sell more. I don't think they had much of a view about democracy, but they thought collapse sounds more dramatic than retreat. And I insisted on the word retreat, because retreat implies the possibility that you can regroup. And I'll give you one anecdote to finish on. My first job before joining the Financial Times was as a reporter, a trainee reporter on the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong. The South China Morning Post is Hong Kong's main newspaper, largest newspaper. It's still there. And this was in the early 1990s. And my Chinese friends, it was still technically British, but a Chinese city. My Chinese friends kept saying to me, complaining, nobody's interested in politics in Hong Kong. All that people care about is money. And that's our culture. And they were sad about this. They wanted to see the development of a more activist culture. Well, last week, 2 million Hong Kongers came out onto the streets. Almost 1/3 of the population, almost 1/3, to protest against a law that would allow extradition of suspects to China. This is even though Hong Kong is under Chinese sovereignty. They call it one country, two systems. These 2 million Hong Kongers came out to protest any breach of the two systems agreement, that they have their own separate rule of law and they do not trust China's. And Xi Jinping, China's president for life, and the protesters stared at each other, and Xi Jinping blinked. An extraordinary moment. This so-called apolitical, passive, population has become brave, active, and it understands how to defend its rights. So for me, that's why liberalism isn't collapsing. It's in retreat, but it's entirely up to us and people like Barbara and individuals and how we act, whether that retreat becomes a return, whether Fukuyama's democratic recession becomes a democratic recovery, or whether it becomes a democratic depression. It's entirely up to us. So let's now have a conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed, very much. That was wonderful as a start. Now, Rebecca and Katja and Ilya, will you come up and join us? And we will unpick Ed's theory of why liberalism is in retreat and just have a look at whether we have a real opportunity to remake democracy in a more vibrant, more open, and indeed, can we rebuild trust in our democracy? We've a wonderful panel who I will introduce very swiftly because you have their CVs, but Rebecca Harms, former leader of the Green Party in the European Parliament, of the Green European, anyway, the Green Group, basically, but a wonderful, long-time engaged politician with Ukraine. Rebecca was just telling me that she first came here to Ukraine in 1988 to go to Chernobyl and see what an environmental disaster had happened there. Ilya Ponomaryov is a politician in exile, a wonderful, engaged, outgoing Russian politician who has been forced to leave his country because he stood up for democratic debate. He dared to disagree. He was the one member of the Duma who voted against the takeover of Crimea. And last, Katja Gorczynska, journalist here in Kiev. I'm sure you all know her better than I do, but I have read Katja writing in The Guardian in Britain, as well as in the Kiev Post, for which you were deputy chief editor, I think, Katja. And she tells me she is going to a new job, but she can't quite tell us yet what it is. She's been in this limbo ever since. Anyway, I want to unpick the thesis about how much of a challenge is democracy facing and how do we rebuild that trust. And Rebecca, I want to start with you, if I may, because you're in a way a bridge from the world where we're losing trust in our old-style democracy, Western Europe and America, to actually the world here where democracy is being built almost from scratch, from years of no democracy. And I'll come to Ilya and Katja then to look at that in terms. But Rebecca, your party is actually one of the revolutionary parties, really. You're upsetting the system. If we look at Germany today, it's not the far-right Alternative für Deutschland that is the real rising power in Germany. It's the Green Party. You've now overtaken the Social Democrats, and indeed, I think in the last poll I saw, you'd actually overtaken the Christian Democrats as the most popular party in Germany. We don't all trust polls, but what's the secret? How are we going to remake democracy as new, but as something we trust? Can I pass that to you? Do you have a microphone?
Yes.
Yep.
But I can switch it
Trying to switch mine off.
on now.
Yeah.
Now it works. Yes. It's a big question, and I'm so kind of very proud of what's so actually happening with my party in Germany. In the same time, I'm not yet convinced that the development of the Greens in Germany will be a development which is what many people now call the green wave in Europe. Actually, it takes place only in 3 countries. This wave takes place only in 3 countries, at least. So if we have a look on the figures, it's in Germany during the European elections now, and in the polls, it's taking place in Ireland. It was quite a surprising result in Irish elections, but also now in the European elections, and it took place in UK. I think in all the 3 countries for different reasons, especially in UK, the Greens profited not that much from Brexit, from the Brexit mood and the anti-Brexit mood as the Liberals, but they profited from this. And whether this wave from those now strong Green parties can be developed into other parts of Europe has to be seen. It depends on what will happen in those countries with the Greens, what they are doing there, but also it depends from whether they are able to recognize that so far the East is completely unaffected by this green wave. And I'm very much thinking about what are the obstacles in between the West and the East to profit from this, in a way, also a new democratic thinking and feeling among citizens in some Western countries. What are the obstacles that it's not jumping onto the citizens and countries in the East? And from my point of view, so partly the Greens are not liberal enough to be seen as the true alternative in Eastern European context. And I'm, so to admit this here, I'm more a liberal Green than a leftish Green. And the Greens have not yet decided on which side of the battle on the system they are. They are for sure not in the neo-authoritarian camp, therefore they are a clear alternative if you have to make your choice in between so new right-wing parties or other new parties. But so whether they have the liberal approaches or a more authoritative approach, for example, when it comes to solutions for answers on global warming, I'm not yet sure. And it will be quite interesting to observe this. I think in Eastern Europe, for good reasons, people want still to escape the more authoritarian patterns of the state. And I very much liked your introduction with this, so memories of your ride to Berlin from Seebrugge and on the German autobahns. I did a bit the same. So I lived close to the Iron Curtain. And when the first news came that not only in Berlin the wall was attacked from the eastern side, but that also people were trying to bring down the fence, which was really out of imagination in 1989. We were driving immediately to the fence and waiting there in a very cold night about the signs to come for those people who were bringing down the fence. And so this process of bringing down the fence and arriving in the Western democratic world, this process still continues. And my reading, for example, about what happened in Ukraine some weeks ago in the presidential election is, let me quote Timothy Snyder on this, whom I appreciate very much as a lecturer in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe, as somebody who understands very well to bridge to bridge the gaps in between our societies. He says about the former Soviet Union republics now on the way to democracy, and it's pretty much the same in Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova right now. He says if those countries manage to come up with 2 generations of new politicians with not any longer their feet in the old systems, then we are out of the patterns of Soviet Union. We see now the first generation of Ukrainians without roots in politicians without roots in the old system, still printed by Soviet Union ideas. And if there will be the next, then we will overcome the patterns. And what the West until today doesn't understand is that it's a long way out of the legacy of Soviet Union. I myself, I witnessed in Western Germany a long way out of the patterns of Nazi Germany. We were not the country, the German country as you know it, the German state as you might think about the German state today. When I was born in '56, we were not this democratic state with very self-confident citizens challenging the politicians as we do it today. When I started to engage myself in politics in the '70s, it was still a very authoritarian system compared to nowadays. The relation in between citizens and state was completely different. So it's a long way out of dictatorship into a true and well-functioning democracy. But even arriving in democracy does not mean that you are on the safe side. Citizens again and again, together with democratic forces, have to win back democracy if democracy comes under threat. And for example, in Germany, so now the Greens are on the rise on the national level, but in the regional elections for Germany in eastern part of Germany, in the regional elections, we will be challenged by the new extreme right party, and how to respond to this in Germany. So there is no alternative than to resist to populism, to don't use populism as a tool to win back your citizens. You have to stand for democratic system. You have to give safety to your citizens, and you have to regain trust of your citizens. So we are not out of this. So Germany is still in this battle to guarantee that we will be also in 10 years on the democratic side.
Rebecca, thank you very much. That's very helpful and I think takes us forward. I want to go straight to Ilya next, because 30 years ago, when Ed was driving frantically across Europe to the Berlin Wall, I was sitting in Moscow watching in stunned amazement as the old Soviet order basically blew up before our eyes, and trust collapsed in all those old Soviet institutions. And it was this quite extraordinary moment. We knew what was happening in Berlin could not have happened if what was happening in Moscow hadn't happened. And it was a moment of extraordinary excitement, at least to us as outsiders. But what went wrong? Why, in fact, did people not say, oh, clearly liberal democracy and the free market, that's what we want? Why do they appear to have gone back to believing in order and, as Ed called it, Potemkin democracy, this travesty of democracy that Putin has created and his people? Or in fact, is there hope? How do you remake the post-Soviet world in Russia?
Thank you very much. It's a sound bit. You know, what you're asking is, maybe I switch off the mic because otherwise it would.
Okay, better.
Okay. Yes, yeah. Yeah, okay, okay. Okay. So what you're asking, I think, it's a very deep philosophical question, which has been discussed many times on many different conferences, and I think that actually the answer is pretty simple. Whatever government, whatever social order should do for its citizen is to increase the living standards. Where Ed was perfectly right, I think. If you have high living standards in the society, people would behave responsibly and they would vote for freedom. But if they are not fed, if they don't have schools, if they don't have hospitals, if they don't have childcare, if they don't have jobs, if they have small wages, then they would vote for whatever populist and whatever who would promise, at least make them promise that they will have all that. And I think that was a great mistake that was done at the time of collapse of the Soviet Union, because of course the intention of overwhelming majority of people who were saying, okay, let's get rid of the old Soviet past, is that they hoped that they would live like in the West. And primarily is that there would be shops where everything would be available for affordable price, and that they can buy it, and that they can travel, and they can enjoy life like it is in the West. And none of them happened. And the more they went to vote, the worse was the life. And here where I disagree with that, because Ed was saying like there was an ascending path towards freedom, to my mind and to mind of 90% of Russians, that was a road to hell. And this is actually why Putin is in power right now, because what he says, we are doing everything to the opposite of what was happening in the 90s. And that's what keeps him in power, because the easiest way for him to confront with whoever opponents he might have is to say, this is the guy from the 90s. This is the guy who wants to go back to the 90s. This is the guy who personally likes Yeltsin. This is the guy who was affiliated at that time. And that's enough to ruin whoever makes it bet for power. And I think that here is a very blurred line which we have to understand and which we need to take into account when we are discussing this whole subject of populism. Democracy is about doing something popular. Is about actually implementing what people want. Is not about unpopular reforms. Sometimes unpopular reforms are needed, but it has to be exclusion. And I think that when Mr. Fukuyama wrote his famous article about the end of history, many of the Western elites, liberal elites, took this as an absolvement of a kind. Okay, so now, you know, there is no confrontation, there is no competition between ideologies. Now we can do whatever we want to do. This Washington consensus, this neoliberal turn, we can do whatever we want to do. And that's not what people want. People want to be heard. And when they are not heard, then they start vote for populists because they don't feel that they are making a responsible choice. You, Quentin, yourself was mentioning Brexit, and we discussed this yesterday. I think that no important decision in general. I am very much for direct democracy and for the referendums, but I don't think that whatever important decision is to be made, it should not be made on the margin of 1%. That's just fundamentally wrong, you know, because whatever things can influence it, and then it's not a stable decision. But it's a question to mechanism. But what many people said after the vote on Brexit is that they voted for Brexit because they didn't believe the Brexit would happen. And they wanted to show to the elites how much they dislike what is happening. and compare the results on the elections on to the European Parliament and national elections. On European Parliament, you would always see way higher results for whatever marginal political parties, because people understand that there is not so much depends in their life on European Parliament. So they're using it as an example how to show to the elites, you know, that they disagree, that they want some changes. Look at the example of Switzerland, which is all based on public referendums which are happening all the time. People vote always extremely responsible on those referendums. They always reject populist initiatives. Why is that? Because they know how they vote, that would be done. And when people see that there is a gap between the vote and the actual policies of the state, then they behave totally different. Look at the American elections. That was the perfect thing. People didn't know who the Trump is. They knew who the Trump is. But they would prefer this unstable, sometimes irresponsible, sometimes maybe even corrupt unknown to a known hypocrisy that was represented by Secretary Clinton. And that's why Trump has won. And unfortunately, this lesson is by far not learned. And my prediction is that Trump would win the re-elections in 2020, because how Democratic Party and my personal political alliance is definitely way more to the left. So I would be more a voter for Democratic Party. But my prediction that Mr. Trump would win, because I don't think that Democrats have actually learned the lesson that they prefer to say it's all Russia, that the elections were rigged, it was because of influence, Putin, blah, blah. It's not. They lost the election. Yeah, there was some outside help, but it was not so important in terms of the outcome of the election. And in Ukraine, to conclude, exactly the same thing happened. The former elites, the outgoing elites, they were so much afraid of asking people even things where they would have won for sure, like the things of the alignment with European and NATO. We have this debate a year ago with the former presidential staff here, and my recommendation, my advice was to put the questions of alignment with European Union and NATO for a public referendum and link it to presidential elections. And I would say if that would have been done, Mr. Poroshenko would be in the office right now, because that was his manifestation, that was his choice. The majority of Ukrainians want to be aligned with European Union. The majority of Ukrainians now, they feel that the NATO is the protection against the aggression. So that would help the former president a lot. But they were afraid of doing this. They prefer to do it behind the scenes in the parliament, but not ask the people. And I think that's a fundamental illness, and whatever populism we are to discuss, we are to blame ourselves.
And Katya, Ilya has taken us towards Ukraine and the lessons from the election you've already had in Ukraine and the one you're about to have. Is this actually vibrant democracy? Is this actually flourishing democracy that we should be looking at from outside and saying, hey, you know, kick the bastards out. That's what it's all about. Is that the answer?
Well, it's a good question, and there are many answers to that. I think we can start by saying it really depends on how you interpret democracy, because Ilya just gave a definition of his own, and which I happen to disagree with, and it's a great tradition for Ukrainians and Russians to disagree on fundamental issues, so I'm going to continue it.
Now it's a tradition between Ukrainians and Ukrainians to disagree.
That's
even more fierce disagreement all the time.
Even more traditional in Ukraine. So I think what Ukrainians strongly believe in, and the way they interpret it. Yes, indeed. So I think Ukrainians have a strong belief in their rights, and the right that they really strongly believe in is the right to elect whoever represents them. And it's in Ukraine. It's been every election has been either like speed dating or Tinder. Like swipe right, swipe left. I don't like you. I don't like you. And we continue recycling our politicians, which is in a sense very democratic. And people who have been resisting. Okay, and people who have resisted or leaving power or succumbed to the not so transparent ways of power transit have been swiped out. And I think because of this deep belief of Ukrainians in their right to elect their leader and elect people who represent them. And we have seen exactly the same thing happening in the last election. And I think that pretty much I don't think there's one thing that Poroshenko could have done to stay in power, because fundamentally they were unhappy with their lives, and it was not necessarily because the economy wasn't growing or they weren't getting enough money, although that's true. Of course, everyone wants improved well-being and expects that from the government. It's the economy stupid, as Bill Clinton famously said. But I think in our case, it's also the feeling of deep injustice that kind of kicked President Poroshenko out, because people really think that he failed to fight the system. He failed to live on his promise. And his promise, as many Ukrainians will remember, in 2014 was also new faces and to live in a new way, жити по-новому. So he was a promise of a new face, new system, new style of living, and new politics. And he did not live by that promise, and hence he is out. Now we have, again, a populist with more promises, except we're not sure what he's promising us, because the whole campaign was pretty virtual. But the message there was we want a new face once again. And about a week ago, I was listening to a radio show with Svetlana Alexievich, the Nobel Prize winner in literature, who lives in Belarus, which is an autocratic state. And she was saying that she's watching Ukraine very closely, naturally, and she's saying, I'm amazed and inspired by the way Ukrainians are striving for their freedom, and they're making one attempt, and then another attempt, and then another attempt, and the fourth. And I was listening to her and thinking, wow, she's actually right. I mean, maybe we're not succeeding, but we're actually trying really, really hard to go for our ideals, for freedom, for democracy, etc. And I think that another important lesson that Ukrainians are starting to learn, close to what Rebecca was saying, that democracy is not a destination, especially not the one that you get to overnight, but it's a path. And Ukrainians are starting to think about transforming their state, their institutions, its processes, its laws, in those terms as well. In many ways, and it kind of happens on two levels. One is the one that we talk about all the time, the big politics through changing the political elites, and it's again going to happen in Ukraine during the parliamentary elections, where clearly the traditional parties are going to do really poorly, and some new parties and completely new people are going to come to govern. But secondly, it also happens through a much less talked about phenomenon when there is a mass influx of professionals from the business community, from NGOs, who come to the government. They perceive it as a public service that they do, almost like a military service sometimes when you talk to these officials. They don't earn a living wage. They literally do not. So their income drops for a number of years, and their families support them. And then they do their little bit and then drop out, and typically exhausted, and it takes some years to rehabilitate themselves. But that type of participation also is hugely on the increase in the past maybe decade, but it's speeding up hugely. And people are starting to think about politics and serving as a in the civil service
as not a one of those dirty things that you don't touch, but actually something noble and something that needs to be done and something that I am going to do. I think that makes Ukraine very different, and yes, in a way, it's making it a flagship kind of phenomenon, perhaps.
I'm torn between two things. I want to get a debate going in the panel, but I want very much to engage you in the audience too and hear your views about what we've been talking about here on the panel. One of the things that I'm struck by is the need in a way to renew our democracy, and that almost certainly means renew it from the bottom up, from the grassroots, whether that's in a form of direct democracy, which Ilya might favor, or just actually community democracy, cities democracy, towns democracy, getting people engaged. And one of the things that really fascinates me about this tipping point we're at, which is why I think it's wonderful to have a Green on the panel, is that actually engagement in environmental issues is really getting people moving. That actually, I've got 5 kids. The only thing that makes my kids go out and vote is actually climate change and getting really worried about what's happening to our planet. And recently in London, we had an extraordinary demonstration by an organization called Extinction Rebellion. And they took over the bridges in the City of London and they tried to bring the city to a standstill. And you know, they got almost universal praise. That people actually went out and said, yes, that's the right thing to do. Now, what about you lot in the audience? Do you think, is it worry about the environment and climate change that will get people engaged? Or what about corruption? That's the thing that I think really undermines trust in institutions. How can we be electing and then re-electing people like Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, or Donald Trump in America, or indeed, are we going to get a Prime Minister Boris Johnson in London? People for whom the word truth is meaningless and who stuff their pockets, I'm not sure about Boris, but certainly Berlusconi and Trump, who just make big business out of politics. How do we stop that? Anybody like to come in from the audience and say, actually, this is what democracy means for us? If not, I'm going to come back to the panel. Think about the question and come back to me in a second. Because, Eddie, we've got the microphones here if you want to take them down. Just think about it. I'm going to go to Rebecca. Rebecca, what about this issue of getting real engagement and movement through environmentalism?
So, first of all, and it's related to your question. First of all, I would like to say that my political career started being an activist against big nuclear facilities planned in my home region. And I was, as a well-known anti-nuclear activist, many years after I organized citizens' protest in my region, I was asked by the Green Party of Germany whether I wanted to become a member of parliament for them. I never expected myself, when I joined first time the Greens in the Parliament of Lower Saxony, I never expected myself to be impressed by the representative democratic system. I wanted to bring revolution and change to the parliament, and I became very much convinced of the parliament as the way to follow the citizens' will and to represent citizens. And so my preferred system for democratic states became and is until today the representative system. If I would have to choose in between direct democracy and one referendum after the next for my own country, so direct democracy versus the micro doesn't work.
Use that.
Okay. So shall I repeat it or?
No, I see many people understand. So
If I would have to make the choice today for Germany between a direct democracy and more referenda versus a well-functioning, serious representation of citizens in parliaments, also very much dedicated to have and to gain and to regain trust of citizens, I always would decide in favor of representation instead of direct democracy. But I'm also very much German in this, so we saw once already in our history that populism as an instrument of Hitler's Nazi party and turning Germans into what was the most terrible force for this continent with very, so especially for Ukraine, very awful consequences. And right now, I think there is, especially among the youngsters of Extinction Rebellion or Fridays for Future, there is in the West, and remarkably, it's very limited to the West, there is a wish to a stronger state to act more powerful in the context of global warming and all the challenges related. Some of them are very close to ask again the question on the system. Is the democratic system the right system to respond to global warming, for example? I think with all the weaknesses of the democratic representative system, there is no better system to respond, for example, also to the challenges of global warming, but you have to participate in the possibilities of the system. You have to defend this system if you want to win in this fight, for example, against global warming.
Okay. Then, Rebecca, I want to go to Ed and say, because aren't people bored with the representative system? They're fed up with the representative system. The old parties have become too self-serving. And so is the answer that people should go out on the streets? How do they deal with the sort of disreputable politicians like a Trump, like a Berlusconi, like a Boris Johnson, who are being thrown up because of this rebellion, if you like, against representative democracy?
I think that a quality that characterizes, that describes, that defines populists is that they're against institutions. They believe that some idea of the popular will is more important than the rule of law, and they believe in strong authoritarian leaders. So a leader who is bigger than institutions, who can interpret the people's will and is bigger than the rule of law. That is ultimately a desperate response to politics as normal, not delivering, not working. That's populism. Populism has a kind of magical thinking that a charismatic leader, a Caesar figure, can cut through all of that stuff and impose the people's will, interpret what's in the people's interests. And of course, it always ends in tears. The question is, what makes it begin? And I think Trump is the perfect American expression for a longing for authoritarianism, for strongman leadership, amongst a significant chunk of America's population that has lost, and has understandably lost, all trust for the representative democracy that they have, for the experts who keep telling them that they're to blame for their own fate and keep cutting taxes for themselves, for the experts who said that market pricing perfectly reflected real conditions in 2007, before the biggest market crash in modern history, when anybody without a high school diploma could have told them this was a bubble. For the experts who said that if we invade Iraq, democracy will spread across the Middle East. These were the people with PhDs. So I totally understand why blue-collar Americans
not just white blue-collar Americans, by the way, a lot of non-whites too, are utterly cynical about the system of representative democracy and about expertise. But they, and here's the key thing, they embrace a cure that is worse than the disease.
I think Russia is different. I think Russia, you have no rule of law, no real rule of law. And in fact, you have not only no rule of law, but the greatest tragedy for me in Russia post-1989 was the failure to disband the KGB. That actually the KGB was simply recreated as the FSB, and you still have this incredibly powerful system of control. But is something happening where we see that maybe in recent times the FSB overreaching itself in the case of Ivan Golunov, the journalist, and so on, that actually is Putin a bit in retreat? Is something happening?
In a sense, Putin is in retreat because his approvals are falling. And that's also, I think, it's a very wide misperception of the nature of the regime in Russia, is that people say, okay, it's a dictatorship. So the Putin is an iron fist who doesn't care about nothing, which I don't believe it's true. The regime in Russia is more Bonapartist type, not after Napoleon, but after Louis Bonaparte III.
Entered referendums.
Yeah, it's, you know, we are here talking a lot about definitions, and being a physicist by training, I don't like the definitions that you are giving to populism or democracy because they are not universal. Democracy is very simple. It's power of the people, period. It's nothing else. All the rest is adjectives to it, and is describing a mechanism. You know, it can be electoral democracy, it can be direct democracy, it can be the sovereign democracy, it can be imitational democracy, Potemkin democracy, you know, socialist democracy, capitalist democracy, bourgeois democracy. But at the end of the day, it's binary. If it is power to the people, it is democracy. If it's to somebody else, to a class, to a group of people, it's not a democracy. It's something that pretends to be democracy, but it's not a democracy. And the same thing about populism, to my mind, this line between democracy and about a democratic leader who says something, being a true representative of people and saying something that goes in the benefit of people who actually sent him to power, delegated him to power, and the populist. I think the line is between that the populist is not going to deliver on his promises, that he is just utilizing popular beliefs, you know, he is reading the polls and trailing the public, maybe fair, maybe unfair, maybe mistakes, maybe right intentions, doesn't matter, but what matters is that he is not serious about this. And many names that you gave today, including the name of Putin, fits under my definition. Putin is the populist because the reality of his, for example, social economic policy is a classical neoliberal policies, but what he says to public is always, you know, some socialist, leftist, you know, etatist things which people like to hear. That's why a lot of observers inside Russia, they always say that Putin is the most liberal, is the most socialist, is the most autocratic, is the most democratic. You know, he is the most of everything because he is not serious. He's postmodernist type of leader who doesn't care about what he says. Being in control of the media, he can twist his actual agenda the way he can do it. But he needs this public opinion. Without this public opinion, he cannot rule, because this public opinion, his popular base, is what gives him the mandate to actually be the arbiter in front of his elites. And what you were saying about KGB is actually very important. You know, in 1935, there was a book written by Leo Trotsky, I believe very popular guy in this particular audience, which the book was called A Betrayed Revolution. And this book contained a prediction of how actually the Soviet Union would collapse, which was exactly how it collapsed in 1991. And the reasons for this collapse was very, very simple. He said that Stalin, by installing the mechanism of permanent repressions, would grow the elite tired, and they would organize the coup, get into alliance with the security forces and apparatchiki, and they would seize the power, privatizing the property. And to privatize the property, they would need the assistance of those security forces, because that's the only way how the property can be taken out of the society in its whole and redistributed for the limited circle of people. And that's why Yeltsin needed to preserve KGB in 90s to successfully do the privatization. That's why they made this alliance between people who are now called in Russia system liberals and the security forces like Anatoly Chubais and people like that. And that's why the choice of Putin was absolutely logical for Yeltsin elite, because Putin was the only guy in their close surrounding who could deliver on the promise to keep the results of privatization. And he delivered on that promise.
Where do you want to come in?
Yeah. So I know that we can talk a lot about what democracy is, what a democratic system is, but I think there are some models which deserve attention and which also I find matter for the Ukrainian situation. And I think democracy alone is not enough. So the state, which is a democratic state, should serve the citizens and should always try to serve all its citizens. And in Germany, after the war, we were helped by our allies and friends to overcome, with a new system, with a new democratic system, our Nazi past. And I think until today that thanks to our allies we established an until today quite well functioning system which partly can help Ukraine to come out of the authoritarian past. And it's not only a one-level system which has been installed. It's a parliamentarian democracy. It's not a presidential democracy. It's a federal system which has a lot of checks and balances in between the center and the regions. And it has its independent institutions which are not always, again and again, always if we change government, it's not the case that we change the institutions or the leadership of the institutions, and it has also the independence of the press with an impressive regulation for all the media in Germany. And so thanks to the allies, we have obviously, according to my understanding in the European Union, we have one of the better systems today, still also better prepared to deal with the challenges of not only populists, but also the new extreme right. No, or let me say, I can't judge, but the improvement of social situation, mainly because of the good development of our economy and industry after the war, was a good precondition for this. And therefore, for example, I'm among those who are advocating a big support, financial support for economic and industrial development of Ukraine right now. I was with Soros and others leading this campaign. Make development possible in Ukraine, risk the 1 or other million to push the economic and thereby the social possibilities.
Okay,
but
Rebecca,
the system has to be developed in the same
can
time.
I put that to Katya? Because you're saying this is the model that could work in Ukraine, but in a way what we're saying is, hang on, isn't that model already exhausted? Is it the right model for Ukraine to bring back good representative liberal democracy and perhaps German federalism?
You know, I think that a particular model that has worked and has been successful in a particular historical context of a particular country with its own, you know, psyche and its own cultural code cannot be replicated anywhere. And hence you would expect that in Ukraine that there would be, even if you attempted to recreate a Germany or a Britain, God forbid, you would end up with something different. But also, you know, we are actually observing how some elements of developed democracies are interpreted here in Ukraine. For example, you in the West are griping about the dissolution and the loss of big major parties that have been driving in politics for literally centuries. And we, like, for us, it's like, big deal. You know, we have 400 parties. And you're griping about the rise of the right-wing politicians and ideologies, and we're like, we've been there, done that. You know, we did that in just a 4-year cycle because, well, I'm exaggerating slightly, but our history already has that element, and the same with the Greens, unfortunately, when people actually used the ideology as a sort of veil to cover their personalities and march in these new emperor's clothes into the parliament, into the government, and then continue business as usual. So, so you're talking about personalities driving politics in Ukraine, and that is actually what we're seeing everywhere in the world. But interestingly, we also have this version of populism going on right now, where we have some elements of what you have described, right? A person who believes in people's will and that it sometimes trumps the rule of law, and this is something that we hear from our president when he was arguing for an early parliamentary election. And yet, at the same time, this is the guy who talks about the failure of institutions and that he has to recreate them, and the failure of rule of law, and actually going in person to the Constitutional Court to argue his case for the early parliamentary elections. So we have, Ilya was talking about different types of democracy. I think Ukraine is a paradoxical democracy.
Yes, that too. I want to give the last word to Ed. Coming from where you set out, and you've heard now some responses from Russia, from Ukraine, what is the way forward? What do you hope is the way forward? And there are 3 journalists on this panel. Is the problem that we're not doing our job? We are actually creating some of these monsters. We are allowing these monsters to... And yet, here am I in Britain. I'm fighting against Brexit. And what does everybody say? You won't win because you haven't got a leader. You haven't got somebody who's going to stand up and fight it. All we've got, all the passion and all the personalities are on the other side. How do we get across?
That's a very good question. It's a very difficult one to answer in an all-purpose, all-time way. I think, as Katja said, it depends on the conditions of the country you're talking about. I was reading about something called Stop Fake in Ukraine. I believe the more that you can crowdsource sort of badges of validation for what is fake and what isn't fake, or what is a valid sort of range of disputable, is a very good thing. Clearly, the state isn't going to be doing stuff like that. But let me just get back to this question of what model democracy. Look, I agree. Power, you know, people. Democracy is ultimately about people running their government. But you've got to define who the people are and what they do with their power. As Bertolt Brecht said, you know, power comes from the people but where does it go? And you know, de Tocqueville wrote about American democracy, and he said that the system was very, very well designed to prevent the tyranny of the majority. And I think, you know, we talk about democracy, we don't talk enough about liberal democracy. And liberal democracy is the importance of whatever the public thinks one particular moment, you know, they might change their mind next year. There have got to be certain inbuilt rights and securities, and the independence of the rule of law and the strength of institutions is an absolutely vital precondition to any functioning democracy. The two go together hand in glove. And so when you see people dismantling independent institutions like Viktor Orban is doing brick by brick, democracy is not going to last much longer. Once the institutions have gone, democracy goes. Just a final point. A lot of people are talking about direct democracy, and I understand the attraction. The thing is, to make decisions about the environment, about trade, about regulation, you need to be informed. You need to actually spend your entire life as a citizen studying up each question and coming to technical decisions. That it's just not practical to have that. We give power to representatives. We as the people loan it to representatives. We entrust them with a limited period of trust. And if they disappoint us, we fire them. That to me is ultimately the most practical form of democracy. We have to reinvent representative democracy. I don't think digital direct democracy. I think this is techno-utopian nonsense. We have to rebuild representative democracy.
Very much, Ed. That's a clear conclusion. I would just like to add two last thoughts. I think it was at least 20 years ago, I remember Grigory Yavlinsky saying a thing that always stayed with me. He said, you know, democracy is also about learning how to lose. Now, he learned quite a lot, but it was a very good point. And actually, right at the beginning, and Ed, you said in your talk, one of the extraordinary things that in Ukraine you seem to be achieving is actually there's a transfer of power which has not brought blood on the streets. And the second thing, democracy, to look very directly at Ilya, is also about being allowed to disagree. And a system that doesn't allow you to disagree, in however shocking a way, is never going to be a democratic system. So anyway. Democracy is a chaotic system, but hey, it may be the only way we've got to get everybody involved. Look, I want to thank all the panelists very much indeed. Thanks for our great start. Ed, thank you for kicking us off. And a great start to the day. And it will carry on, and just as we have started. And so I hope you'll remain very engaged. Thanks very much. Please thank the panel.